Wait till. Well, good evening to all of you all who are here in our sanctuary. It is 6:30, or as our clock in the sanctuary says, it is 18:30. We're on military time for some reason, our clock that I look at, but 6:30, and so we welcome you folks who are here in our sanctuary, and we welcome you folks who are now with us online. If you're on Facebook or on YouTube, we're glad you're here. If you're watching us live, we're glad you're here. If you're watching this sometime later in the week, we're also glad you're here. We had a lot of folks watching this study during the week last time, and I'm grateful for that. So whenever you're watching it and wherever you are, near and far, we welcome you to our second week of this study on the life of David, the man the Bible calls the man after God's own heart. So I'm going to let me take 2 minutes to recap where we are. We started in the book of 1 Samuel, that Samuel is really the last of the judges, these leaders who ruled, judged Israel, leading up to the time of the monarchy. The people said, we want a king like all the other countries. We don't want to be the only one without a king. Give us a king. Samuel was not pleased with that. God was not pleased with that, but God said, let them have what they want, and they may be sorry. So the man that was chosen to be the first king of Israel was Saul. Saul, son of Kish, from the tribe of Benjamin. A man, it said, was taller than any other man in the kingdom. A mighty warrior, a natural leader, and seemed like a good choice. He won many battles against the Philistines. But he had a problem with obeying God. Samuel would tell him what God wanted, and he would not follow. God said, don't take any of the plunder from this battle, and they took the plunder. He took it upon himself, Saul took it upon himself to offer a sacrifice to God when that should have been the priest's job. And things like that continued to erode Samuel's confidence that this was the right guy. And God finally said, he's not the right guy. He hasn't listened to me. He hasn't listened to my prophet Samuel. We're going to pick a new king. So he sent Samuel to the town of Bethlehem to a man named Jesse who had multiple sons. And he said, that's the house where you'll find the next king. And Jesse brought his sons out, and one by one, these big strapping boys passed in front of Samuel, and God said, nope, not that one, nope, not that one, nope, not that one, until they ran out of sons. And Samuel said, is that all? And he said, well, there's the youngest is out in the field watching the sheep. Bring him in. That youngest was David. God said, he's the one, even though he's not the biggest or the tallest. He's the one I've chosen. He's the one whose heart I've looked at. And so Samuel took the horn of oil and poured it on David's head. That's called anointing. And so he anointed him to be the next king, but in secret. He didn't become the king then. He's just an adolescent boy. Then we know the stories we focused on last time, how David came into the sphere of Saul. The most famous story being when Saul and his army were on one side of a valley, and the Philistine army was on the other side of the valley. And the Philistines had an enormous warrior named Goliath who was taunting Israel and taunting Israel's God and saying, come and fight me one-on-one. We'll decide the battle that way. No one in Israel was willing to face Goliath. It looked like he was unbeatable until this kid David shows up and says, he's insulting God and I'll fight him. And there was laughter and derision, and yet Saul said, well, why not? So he sent David out, and David took a slingshot and 5 rocks, and he was an expert with the slingshot. He had been used to defending the sheep from bears and wolves. He hit Goliath straight between the eyes, and then he went over and killed Goliath, and the people were excited, and they chased the Philistines. And David is taken into Saul's court as both warrior and musician. For David is skilled at the harp. And we know, of course, that later on David will be the writer of songs and psalms. And so we left chapter 17 with that great victory over Goliath and Saul celebrating the victory they had over the Philistines. And so we pick up now with chapter 18 of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 18. And we learn about somebody else from the royal family. It says 18:1, excuse me, after David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. We now meet the crown prince, Jonathan, Saul's son. And Saul's son, Jonathan, who is next in line to be the next king, has an immediate, close friendship with David. And they become like brothers. They become closer than brothers. It says in verse 2, from that day Saul kept David with him, didn't let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic, even his sword, his bow, and his belt. He makes a covenant with David. The word in the Old Testament for covenant, we see it quite a few times. The Hebrew word is berit, is the Hebrew word, and it is more than just a promise. It's more than just a bargain. It's more than just a contract. It is an agreement made in the presence of God. It is a binding, unbreakable oath. And we see covenants all through the Old Testament. And we see the covenant that God makes when, after the flood of Noah, he says, I make a covenant now, never again to flood the earth. And the sign of the covenant was the rainbow. He made a covenant with Abraham and said, your descendants will become a great nation. And your descendants, the descendants of Abraham, will be a kingdom of priests, and they'll bless the whole world. So we talk about the covenant made with Noah. We talk about the covenant made with Abraham. And so these covenants go all the way through the Old Testament, of course, until we get to the covenant of Jesus, the new covenant. I've said before that really, if we were starting over and instead of calling the Bible two sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament, we would probably be better suited to call them the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. That would be a more accurate name for those two parts of the Bible. But here, Jonathan and David make this covenant. And of course, think about Jonathan. He's the prince. And David is from a poor family. And so Jonathan takes off his robe, which probably is a richly ornamented kind of robe, the robe that somebody who was in the royal family would wear. And he takes off that robe and gives it to his friend David, as well as a sword and a bow and all these things. I mean, think about a robe was often a sign of favor. Think back to somebody else who had a famous robe back in the book of Genesis, Joseph, who had his coat or his robe, the way we're brought up, the coat of many colors. Or as the Broadway musical, the Technicolor Dreamcoat. And unfortunately, Hebrew scholars said it may not have translated as multicolored. It may have just meant ornamented or fancy. But anyway, a robe meant somebody who had some sort of prestige. And so Jonathan, the crown prince, takes off his robe and gives it to David. And the two of them become these close friends. And it said David immediately becomes a big hit. Verse 3, whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. And this pleased all the people and Saul's officers as well. So David quickly rises to a high position because everything he touches turns to gold. Everything he does well. He has success, everything he does. And so they're having great success against their hated rivals, their hated enemy, the Philistines. And it says, here's the first sign of real trouble. 18:6. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and tambourines and lutes, and they danced and they sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Now, this song is exaggeration. It's a song. No man in a day of hand-to-hand combat, no man in a day where you're killing people with a sword or a spear, no man is going to kill thousands of enemies. No man is, of course, going to kill tens of thousands of enemies. This is an exaggeration because it's a song of celebration. And the women got the tambourines going, but in the song, they're saying, boy, Saul is a great hero. He's killed thousands of the Philistines. And David, man, he's killed tens of thousands of the Philistines. And this song that the women probably didn't really think too much about how it might be heard, this song immediately gnaws at Saul. This song immediately begins to gnaw at him. It says in verse 8, Saul was very angry. This refrain galled him. They've credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. So this is the first sign of trouble. Up to this point, Saul is, of course, grateful that this kid has defeated the Philistine giant and then led the battle, and they've defeated the Philistines, and things are great, and they've had this great victory, and there's celebration, and yet this little song spoils it all for Saul. He can't celebrate anything because this song galls him, it says. It gnaws at him. It eats at him with jealousy. And he thinks, he's more popular than I am. And if he's more popular than I am, he's now a rival. He's an enemy. And it said the very next day, down verse 10, the next day, an unclean spirit from God came forcefully upon Saul. And I've mentioned before, this, whenever it says spirit, unclean spirit, injurious spirit is another way of translating this word, this unclean spirit. Every time it appears in the Bible, we're not ever sure exactly what we're talking about. Are we talking about an affliction? Are we talking about an illness? Are we talking about a condition like epilepsy? Or are we talking about a mental illness? Or are we talking about some force, some supernatural force? And the Bible has a way of going back and forth on that. You go back to the story of Pharaoh and Moses, and it'll say, then Pharaoh hardened his heart. And then the next time around, it'll say, then God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And then it'll say, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And it says all three of those. Pharaoh hardened his heart. God hardened his heart. His heart was hardened. And as I said before, the Hebrew reader, those are all the same thing. We would kind of split those into, exactly who's hardening whose heart? Is it Pharaoh's fault? Is God making this happen? Well, for the Hebrew people, God is ultimately in charge of everything. But here there's this jealousy, this seed of resentment that starts to grow inside of Saul. And it says, he was prophesying in his house, and David is playing the harp, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Now, this seems like an impulsive act, because we know David is brought into the house to calm Saul down. Saul had these moments, these fits of rage, these fits of depression. And they said something needs to be done because the king is going kind of nutty. And they thought music will help to soothe this storm inside of him. And that's why David is there. But apparently, as Saul is sitting there, he's got a spear right at his hand, and he just suddenly kind of snaps and just throws the spear. And it's taken, apparently, as this kind of a fit of crazy impulse. Because after that, things seem to go back to normal. David dodges, and life goes on. It says, however, the author tells us in verse 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had left Saul. Saul, whatever he used to have, the feeling that God was with him, the feeling that he had been chosen by God, empowered by God, strengthened by God, all that was gone. And he felt his power slipping away, and he felt David had the favor of God on him. So, what's he going to do about it? What's Saul going to do about it? Verse 13, he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men. And David led the troops in their campaigns. Now, this is the theme we're going to start to see several times. Well, I'm just going to keep sending him on dangerous mission after dangerous mission. I'm going to put him in harm's way, and maybe things will just fall out right for me. I'm going to keep sending David to be the point man of battle. So he sends David out to command troops. But every time he sends David out, David is successful. David wins battles. It says, in everything he did, this is David we're talking about in 18:14. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. He's afraid of him because he sees the favor of God on David. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. So he's a war hero. He's a war hero. He's the General Patton. He's the Arnold Schwarzenegger, whatever. He's the guy that everybody's like, this is the guy we want fighting the Philistines. And he gains huge popularity. But Saul is afraid of him, afraid of his popularity. So, Saul starts to think of ways he can get rid of David. So Saul says to David, in verse 17, here's my older daughter, Merab. I'll give her to you in marriage, only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord. Saul said to himself, I won't raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that. So, again, he's going to put him in harm's way, let the battles kill him. Now, tuck that away. How do you get rid of somebody? Well, you send him into battle. Unfortunately, later on, we're going to see David use the same strategy. Many, many, many years in the future, how do you get rid of somebody? How do you get rid of a problem? You send them into battle and let the enemy kill them. That's Saul's strategy here, and tragically, David is a great person, but he's not perfect, and at his lowest moment, we're going to see David use the very same strategy to get rid of a problem. So Saul says, I'm going to give him my oldest daughter, because way back when he said, any man who can beat Goliath, I'll give my daughter to. This is a promise he made before he even met David, or he knew that David was going to be the one to fight Goliath. So he says, I'm going to give him my daughter, but I'm also going to make sure she's a widow by sending him into battle. So, verse 17, Saul says to David, here's my older daughter, Merab. I'll give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely, fight my battles. And he's thinking, I'll let the Philistines kill him. But David said to Saul, 18, who am I? What is my family or my father's clan in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law? In other words, who am I to become married to a princess? I'm a shepherd. I'm from a poor family, and you're going to marry me off to the princess? You're going to marry me to the king's daughter? I'm not blue blood. I'm not an aristocrat. I'm not somebody who marries the daughter of the king. So David's like, I don't think I'm not the right person. I'm not important enough to do that. And so he doesn't marry her. And so it says in 19, when it came time for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, instead she's given in marriage to this other guy, Adriel of Mahola. And we don't know anything about that guy. His story, we don't know what his deal is. But the oldest daughter of Saul is married off to somebody else because David is like, I'm not good enough for that. But Saul has another daughter. Verse 20. Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David. And when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. I'll give her to him, he thought, so that she may be a snare to him, and the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So he's still thinking he's going to use his daughter to get David into a bad position, a deadly position. So he said to David, now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law. Here's another daughter, and she's in love with you. She loves you. Michal loves you. And Saul ordered his attendants, speak to David privately and say, look, the king is pleased with you. His attendants all like you. Become his son-in-law. Tell him he really wants you to be married to his daughter. So they repeated this to David, but David said once again, do you think it's a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known. I'm not in that circle. But, verse 24, Saul's servants told him what David said, and Saul said, say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies. Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines. So this is common in the Middle East. What is the bride worth? You pay, a dowry. You pay a bride fee, and so often, when a young man wants to marry a young woman, the father would say, well, you can have my daughter, for 3 cows or whatever. You can have my daughter for 2 ox, or this girl's really good. She's a 4 ox girl, or whatever. She's worth this much of payment to marry my daughter. And so now Saul says, well, the price to marry Michal is 100 Philistine foreskins. Now this is a lesson that would be tough to teach at VBS, because explaining to kids what's a foreskin. But remember, we're talking about the Jews circumcise their male children on the 8th day. That is one of the laws that was given to Abraham early on. Abraham is told, you are to circumcise your son, and all the males who come into the children of Abraham, they're all to be circumcised. All you have, the foreskin of the penis is to be cut off on the 8th day. This was not something that all tribes and all peoples in Canaan did. Matter of fact, it is in many ways unique to the Jewish people. And it was done, it wasn't, you don't see in the Bible this was done for hygiene or any other reason than, as they said, a mark to show that they were different. A mark in the flesh to show that these Israelites were different and separate from all the other Canaanites. And you see, as the Bible goes on, the way they refer to their enemies, people like the Philistines, they'll say, are we going to let these uncircumcised dogs get away with this? To be uncircumcised was an insult for a Jew to refer to any other foreign people, because the Jews had this covenant, and that's what they call it, this same word, berit. They call it a covenant in the flesh of circumcision. And that's, of course, to this day, Jewish males are circumcised on the 8th day, and it is a celebration. I mean, it is done with a gathering of family, and there is a special Jewish person whose job it is to circumcise the young males. He's called a moil. And the moil will come to the home and circumcise the boy, the male child, on the 8th day. And then after the circumcision, it's mazel tov, and it's a party to celebrate that this young 8-day-old boy has now become part of the family of Abraham. So circumcision, even though it sounds to us like a really odd way to become part of this group, is something that we see again all through the scriptures. And so Saul says to David, those Philistines, they're uncircumcised. So to prove that you killed them, bring me 100 foreskins. Because that way I'll know they're not Israelites you've killed. You know, you couldn't just kill Israelites and get this. The only way to get these foreskins is to go to an enemy and kill the males and take this from them. And David, when he's given this idea, actually responds this way in verse 26. When the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. Now he could earn it. Before he said, who am I to marry the princess? But now he's been given, okay, if you complete this task, you will now be worthy to marry the king's daughter. And David's like, okay, well now I can feel good about this because I'll have done something to please the king and earn the right to marry his daughter. So he's like, okay, I'm up for that. And of course, Saul thinks if he goes out and tries to kill 100 Philistines, he's going to get killed and I'll be rid of him. So it was all a plot to get rid of David, giving him this seemingly extremely dangerous task to go bring this prize back. And so, still in verse 26, the allotted time elapsed. David and his men, which probably means his close, his little group of, his elite squad, went out and killed 200 Philistines. So, double what Saul had requested. He brought their foreskins and presented the full number to the king so that he might become the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him his daughter Michal in marriage. And again, imagine this in a movie when he comes back with this prize, kind of a grisly scene. But he doubles, just for good measure, he doubles the request, brings back double what he was asked, and Saul then gives him his daughter Michal. Verse 28, when Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became even more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. Think about Saul now. His son, the prince, is David's best friend. His daughter, Michal, is married to David. And yet, even with those close connections now, he's his son-in-law, he's his son's closest friend, he is so afraid of him usurping his power and taking his place that he still is determined to get rid of him. So, it says in verse 30, the Philistine commanders continued to go out into battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. So David's star, David's fame continues to ascend, and Saul's jealousy and paranoia continues to spiral downward. So, we start to see him getting more desperate. Chapter 19. Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan was very fond of David and warned him, my father Saul's looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there. I'll go out and stand with my father in a field where you are. I'll speak to him about you and tell you what I find out. And you still get the impression in this that Jonathan is thinking, well, Dad's having one of his spells. Dad is off today. He's a little... he has these weird episodes where he gets into these crazy moods, and he's like, let me talk. And so it says, Jonathan, verse 4, Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, let not the king do wrong in his servant David. He hasn't wronged you. And what he's done has benefited you greatly. He took the life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all of Israel. You saw it. You were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason? Come on, Dad. That doesn't even make sense. And Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath. As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. Okay. He's made an oath before the Lord. He's seen reason. He's come to his senses. He understands. Because have we seen any hint that David is fomenting rebellion? No. have we seen any hint that David is looking for an opportunity to take the throne away from Saul? No. All through this story, right up until the death of Saul, we never see David take any active move to usurp the throne. Even though as an adolescent he was told, anointed by Samuel, you're going to be the king, David understands apparently, well, someday that's going to happen, but that's in God's hands. That's the Lord's business, the timing, and I'm not going to be a rebel. I'm not going to usurp the king. I'm not going to be a traitor. I'm not going to commit treason. So here Jonathan says, Dad, this doesn't make any sense to kill a loyal man and a great soldier like David. And Saul's like, okay, yeah, you're right. I swear, I won't kill him. And we think, okay. So Jonathan called David and told him the whole conversation. He brought him to Saul, and David was with Saul as before. Like, okay, we've healed the breach. David is back, playing his harp, fighting his battles. Everything's okay. Once more war broke out. David went out and fought the Philistines, and he struck them with such force that he fled before them. But an injurious spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear. While David was playing the harp, he tried to pin him to the wall with his spear. But David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. And that night, David made his escape. So we've seen this before. That happened again. Saul's having one of his spells. Saul's having one of his episodes of rage. And David hightails it out of there. So now Saul says, well, I'm just going to go ahead and kill him. I'm going to go ahead and kill him. So Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, if you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. So Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. And Michal took an idol and laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair at the head. Now, right there, we kind of stop for a minute and go, wait a minute. Idol? Idol? Hey, Patrick, I'm gonna cough. And I don't want to blow. Oh, didn't want to blow your ears out. Oh. So we say, wait a minute, why does she have idols? And, there isn't any particular explanation of this. The author doesn't comment like, she had an idol and this is terrible, or this was... And so the word there that's translated in my Bible as idol, Michal took an idol. The word in Hebrew there is teraphim. Let me write that up for you here. Teraphim is the word that's translated idol. And this is one of those words in Hebrew that the scholars say, we're not really sure what it means. There are those words in Hebrew, in the ancient Hebrew, that occur so few times in the Bible that the context doesn't necessarily tell us what the word means. And so we think it meant some kind of household idol. And what did that mean? Did that mean that Michal herself was not fully free of idolatry? Because we know that sometimes, even among the people in Israel, their idolatry sometimes still slipped in. Matter of fact, if you remember, this is not one of the major points of the story, but if you remember when Jacob was serving his uncle Laban, and he'd married Rachel and Leah, and they had those kids, and then finally Jacob decides, I better get out from under my uncle because I'm tired of serving him. And they left in the middle of the night, and it says that Rachel packed her idols with her. And you're like, wait a minute, Rachel packed her idols? Why does she have idols? And it's the same word as this word, teraphim. Some people thought it was some sort of pagan idol. Some people thought it was more of what you might call a household idol that was honoring ancestors. Different theories about exactly what this idol was, and was it something that the author here doesn't seem to condemn. Matter of fact, she uses it here, Michal uses it as a decoy, because she takes it and puts it in the bed and puts goat hair on it to fool the soldiers that David is sick in bed, which I've seen that in movies at least, where somebody puts a mannequin or a pillow or something in a bed to fool somebody, to think somebody's there when they're not, and that's what Michal does. And she's like, he's sick, you can't kill him right now, he's sick, he can't come back some other time. And the men go back. What do you think about that? I'm sorry, you can't kill me right now, I'm sick. So the men leave and go back to Saul and say, well, he's sick. And then Saul sent the men back to see David and told him, bring him to me in his bed so that I may kill him. This may be, at least in some ways, a matter of honor, that you don't kill somebody in their bed. You fight them or kill them in an honorable way in battle, not assassinating them as they're under the covers. But Saul says, I don't care, bring him in his bed. But verse 16, when the men entered, there was the idol in the bed, and the head was some goat hair. And Saul says to Michal, why did you deceive me like this and send my enemy away so that he escaped? What do you think? He's saying, why did you send your husband away so that I couldn't kill him? Why did you send my son-in-law away so that I couldn't kill him? And Michal at this point lies. Again, we don't seem to blame her for lying, because she says, well, David said to me, let me away, why should I kill you? So Michal says, well, he threatened me and said he'd kill me if I didn't let him go, which is not true. She's the one who told him to leave. But to not get her father mad at her, she says, well, it wasn't my fault. So David fled, in verse 18, and made his escape. And he went to Samuel. Samuel's still around, at Ramah, and told him all that Saul had done to him. So remember, Samuel is the one who anointed first Saul and then later David. He told Samuel about him. And Samuel went to Naioth, and stayed there. And word came to Saul, David is in Naioth at Ramah. So he sent men to capture him. Now here's where it gets a little odd. Okay, so stick with us here. So he sent men to capture him. But when they saw a group of prophets prophesying, with Samuel standing there as their leader, the Spirit of God came upon Saul's men, and they also prophesied. Saul was told about it. He sent more men, and they prophesied too. Saul sent them in a third time, and they also prophesied. Finally, he himself left for Ramah and went to the great cistern at Seku, and he asked, where are Samuel and David? Over in Naioth at Ramah. So Saul went to Naioth at Ramah, but the Spirit of God came even upon him, and he walked among prophesying until he came to Naioth. He stripped off his robes and also prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay that way all day and all night. This is why people say, is Saul also among the prophets? Now we need to understand what prophesying here means. And again, what it means here in this context, what it means in the Old Testament here, is not, when we think of prophesying, we think of someone saying, thus saith the Lord, next year there's going to be famine, or, thus saith the Lord, the Babylonians are going to come and invade us, or something like that. A prophet giving a warning about what's coming, a warning to the people. But this is not that. This is ecstatic worship. In other words, this is what you might expect to see in a Pentecostal type church, except kind of turned up to 11. In other words, this is people in ecstasy, losing control, and in dancing and singing and falling down and going kind of out of control. And notice Saul throwing off his clothes. This is the prophets going into this ecstatic worship. And this is something that we see, and I don't know how many of you all have ever been in a service where people, not just where, I mean, there's Pentecostal where there might be things that we are not accustomed to in worship, people speaking in tongues, some things like that. We're not talking about just that. We're talking about a total sort of loss of control, where people are losing control of their bodies and falling down and yelling and screaming and doing things that their bodies have completely lost any control. And that's what we're talking about here, that these men that are sent to capture David and Samuel fall into this ecstatic condition. This is not something that is limited to Judaism or Christianity. Other religions and other even practices have people who go into an ecstatic, out of control state. And I don't want to get too sidetracked on that, other than, I think that when you have lost all control, it's pretty hard to produce the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, etc. That worship that entails a total loss of control of your body may not be what we should be shooting for in terms of worship. I just because I went to a seminary with all kinds of people from all kinds of different backgrounds and all different denominations and all different non-denominations, I've been around folks, Pentecostal folks and charismatic folks and people who worshiped in lots of different ways. And I think this is something more than that. This is something, a loss of control that comes across here, and it paralyzes the men and even paralyzes Saul. My Bible has this note. It says, prophets are usually pictured as somber figures. 1 Samuel reveals a different side. Prophecy accompanying ecstatic worship. Saul had met a musical band of such prophets soon after he was anointed king. Now that he was planning evil, however, meeting the Spirit of God made him utterly lose control. So they lose all control, and his plan to capture David and kill David fails. And it says at that point then, chapter 20, David fled from Naioth at Ramah and went to Jonathan. He goes back to his best friend, Saul's son, the prince, and you can hear David's just utter frustration here. He says to his friend, his best friend, "What have I done? What is my crime? How have I wronged your father that he's trying to take my life?" In other words, explain this to me. What have I done to make your father hate me? What have I done to make the king try to kill me? And Jonathan says, "Never. You're not going to die. Look, my father doesn't do anything, great or small, without confiding in me. Why would he hide all this from me? It's not so." And you think, well, haven't you seen, Jonathan, haven't you seen your father just kind of go out of control and throw spears and all that? And either Jonathan is kind of in denial, or he thinks, oh, well, he has those spells. He has those, he has those spells, but that's not him. He just, he has this problem. He says, no. He's not. He doesn't really want to kill you. I would know if he was trying to kill you. David took an oath. "Your father knows very well that I have found favor in your eyes." And he said to himself, "Jonathan must not know this, or he'll be grieved. Yet as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, there is only a step between me and death." It's like, Jonathan, I tell you, he's trying to kill me. And it's not just these little spells. He has got a plan to kill me. Jonathan said, "Well, whatever you want me to do, I'll do." And David says, "Look, tomorrow's the new moon festival. I'm supposed to dine with the king." You're like, dine with the king? Wait a minute, he just tried to kill you. Well, this is where we kind of have to understand that, at least as we read this, one, we're not sure how much time elapses between each of these stories. We're reading it as if, and then the next day this happened, and then the next day this happened, and then this. That's probably not the way this is. There's probably a flare-up and a cool-down and a reconciliation and I was crazy that day, I'm sorry. I mean, there's probably time passing between some of these episodes that we are not reading about. that would explain why David is still considered part of the army. But David's in a spot where, what's he to do? If he abandons Saul, well, he's a traitor. He's a deserter. And Saul has reason, at least in theory, to go after him. If he stays close to Saul, he's putting his life in danger when Saul might have one of these fits and decide it's time to kill him. So he's kind of, either way, he's in trouble. If he runs off, he gives Saul an excuse to come after him. If he stays close, he has to sleep with one eye open. You wonder, well, why is Saul keeping him close in between bouts of trying to kill him? Well, I know, if you ever watch Game of Thrones, or some of these shows about court intrigue and murder plots and plots within plots. When we got to go to France a few years ago, we went to Versailles, and I don't know if anyone here has ever been to Versailles, but Versailles was the palace that Louis XIV built as his hunting lodge outside of Paris, but then he kept making it more grand and more grand and more grand until it became this incredible, place. And he forced all of the courtiers to come and stay with him there all the time. And like, why? Well, keep your friends close and keep your enemies closer. He wanted to have all of the courtiers living there with him at Versailles so he could keep an eye on them, and so he could make sure they weren't plotting against him. And they couldn't live at their own houses. They couldn't manage their own lands. They had to stay at Versailles all the time and spend all their days gossiping and gambling and going to dances. Because Louis had decided that it was in his best interest to keep these people who might try to overthrow him, to keep them close where he could keep an eye on them. And that is something that we see in history over and over and over again. And so, maybe that's what's going on here. So here David says, I'm supposed to be at the New Moon Festival. In other words, I'm supposed to be at court. And I'm supposed to dine with the king, the one who's been trying to kill me. But let me go and hide in the field until the evening of the day after tomorrow. If your father misses me at all, tell him, David earnestly asked my permission to hurry to Bethlehem, his hometown, because an annual sacrifice is being made there for his whole clan. If he says, very well, then your servant is safe. But if he loses his temper, you can be sure he's determined to harm me. As for you, show kindness to your servant, for you've brought him into a covenant with you before the Lord. If I'm guilty, then kill me yourself. Why hand me over to your father? Never, Jonathan said. If I had the least inkling that my father was determined to harm you, wouldn't I tell you? David asked, who will tell me if your father answers you harshly? Now let's go out in the field. They went there. So think about this just for a minute. Who, other than Saul, is most harmed by David if David is indeed going to become the next king? Who is the person who's most harmed? Jonathan. Jonathan is in line to be the next king. He's the crown prince. And yet, and you'd think, okay, well, if Jonathan is the crown prince, and Saul is convinced that David is after the throne, you'd think, well, the person who would be even more inclined to be an enemy of David would be Jonathan. But their friendship supersedes all of that. Their friendship supersedes any personal ambition, any professional jealousy, anything else. The friendship between David and Jonathan is a model of male friendship, of loyalty, of honesty, of integrity, of putting the other person's interests above your own. We see in David and Jonathan this model of friendship. And David is really the recipient of Jonathan's sacrifice. Jonathan doesn't seem to mind or care about his father's paranoia about, saying, well, you're going to lose the throne if David gets too high. Jonathan has made a covenant with David to be friends for life. And they're like brothers. And nothing is going to break that, even this, who's going to be the next king after Saul. And so he says, well, how will I know if your father is determined to kill me? So he says, well, let's show this, verse 11. Let's go out in the field. So they went there together. Jonathan said to David, by the Lord, the God of Israel, I will surely sound out my father by this time the day after tomorrow. If he's favorably disposed towards you, will I not send you word and let you know? If my father is inclined to harm you, may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if I don't let you know and send you away safely. May the Lord be with you as he's been with my father, but show me unfailing kindness like that of the Lord as long as I live. I may not be even when the Lord cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth. So, I'll let you know, and, if you should rise, then just, be my friend and a friend of my family. Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David. May the Lord call David's enemies to account. Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of love for him. He loved him as he loved himself. So Jonathan said to David, tomorrow is the new mist because your seat will be empty. The day after tomorrow evening, go out to the place where you hid when this trouble began and wait by the stone Ezel. I'll shoot 3 arrows to the side of it as though I were shooting at a target. Then I'll send a boy and say, go find the arrows. If I say to him, look, the arrows are on the side of you, bring them here. Then come, because as surely as the Lord lives, you're safe. There's no danger. But if I say to the boy, look, the arrows are beyond you, you must go, because the Lord has sent you away. And about the matter you and I discussed, remember, the Lord is witness between you and me forever. So David hid in the field. So you get to what they're going to say. He's got, you hide out there. I'm going to talk to my father, and then I'm going to come out here, and I'm going to shoot arrows. And if I say, the arrows are there by you, boy, that means all clear, you're good, you're not in danger. If I say, the arrows are beyond you, it means Dad is going to try to kill you, run. That's the key word. That's how you'll know when I yell that, whether to come or to run. So that's the plan. So David hid in the field. When the new moon festival came, the king sat down to eat. He sat in his customary place by the wall, opposite Jonathan. Abner sat next to Saul. Abner, we're going to meet more about him later. He's one of the generals of the army. But David's place was empty. Saul said nothing that day. He thought, well, something must have happened to David to make him ceremonially unclean. Surely he's unclean. Now remember what we mean by this, unclean. Unclean has nothing to do with, or has very little to do with hygiene. Clean and unclean is not about hygiene. It's about kosher, not kosher. And things made you unclean. Unclean meant you could not participate in any religious festival, like a new moon festival. Unclean meant you couldn't go into the temple. Of course, at this point, the temple hasn't been built, so the tabernacle at this point. You couldn't offer a sacrifice. You couldn't participate in a religious ceremony or a religious festival if you were unclean. And unclean is not about being muddy or dirty. It's about, have you done something to make you unclean? For example, if you touched a dead body, that made you unclean. Touching a dead body made you unclean. For a man, and again, some of these laws seem very sexist. A woman was unclean during her menstrual period. If a man touched his wife during her menstrual period, that made him unclean. A woman was unclean after she gave birth for a certain number of days. She was unclean for 30 days if she gave birth to a boy. She was unclean for 60 days if she gave birth to a girl. Again, showing the inherent paternalism of the culture. But different things made you unclean. Think about the story of the Good Samaritan in the New Testament. Jesus tells the story. The guy's laying there bleeding. Looks like he might be dead. And a priest comes by and keeps walking. Why? Is it just because the priest is a cold-hearted so-and-so? Maybe, but also the priest knew that if he went over and touched that guy and he was dead, he's now unclean. And he can't go do his job as a priest. Same way with the Levite. The guy's laying there, bloody. Is he dead or alive? If the Levite goes over and touches that body and he is dead, the Levite is now unclean and unable to participate in a religious ceremony. So unclean or unkosher is not about did you wash your hands, although hand washing is a part of one of the rituals, but it's not about hygiene. It's about ceremonial cleanliness. It's about being kosher, which means clean. And we know there are some animals that are clean, like a cow is clean, but a pig is unclean. Some foods are kosher. A pot roast is clean. Bacon is unclean. One is kosher, the other is not kosher. So when David fails to show up at the feast on the first day, Saul goes, well, he must be unclean. In other words, he must have touched a dead body, because if you're fighting Philistines and killing them by the hundreds, you're touching a lot of dead bodies. Maybe Michal is on her period. Maybe whatever. Maybe, whatever reason David's not here, he's probably unclean. And so that, when we hear the word unclean, we gotta remember that even though we think clean as, use soap and water, clean has to do with ceremonial uncleanliness in this setting. So something must have made him unclean. 27, but the next day, the second day of the new moon festival, his seat's empty again. Saul said to his son Jonathan, why hasn't the son of Jesse come to the meal, either yesterday or today? Jonathan said, well, David earnestly asked me for permission to go to Bethlehem. He said, let me go because our family's observing a sacrifice in the town and my brothers ordered me to be there. If I found favor in your eyes, let me get away to see my brothers. That's why he hasn't come to the king's table. Seems like a pretty reasonable explanation, even though, of course, it's not true. It's a lie, but Saul doesn't know that. But he says, oh, David, he's the prince, remember. David asked me to be excused. His family's having a big ceremony down in Bethlehem. I said it'd be fine. That's why he's not here. Verse 30, Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan. He said to him, you son of a perverse and rebellious woman. Don't I know that you've sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you? As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send and bring him to me, for he must die. Yikes. First he says that Jonathan's mother, one of his wives, he calls her, the equivalent of some bad words that we wouldn't want to call a woman. He says that you have endangered your own kingdom, and by siding with this David, and bring him to me now so that we can kill him. And Jonathan now makes a logical case. He says, why should he be put to death? What has he done? Jonathan asked his father. But Saul hurled his spear at him to kill him. His paranoia and his rage, he throws a spear at his own son. Jonathan knew that his father intended to kill David. Jonathan got up from the table in fierce anger on that second day of the month. He didn't eat. He was grieved at his father's shameful treatment of David. Now Jonathan fully realizes that what he thought was not possible is the reality. His father is set on killing David. His father has gone completely irrational. His father is not going to listen to any kind of reason. Even though Jonathan said, what has he done to deserve this? What has David done to deserve your wrath? Why? Why do you want him dead? And the only answer is he's a threat to your throne. He's too popular. He's too famous. He's too good. So, remember, they set up the signal. So the next morning, Jonathan goes out to the field. He had a small boy with him. He said to the boy, run and find the arrows. As the boy ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. And the boy came to the place where Jonathan's arrow had fallen. Jonathan called out, isn't the arrow beyond you? Which is the signal that means Saul wants you dead. Then he shouted, hurry, go, quickly. Don't stop. And the boy picked up the arrows and returned to his master. And the author reminds us the boy knew nothing of all this. Only Jonathan and David knew the code words. Jonathan gave his weapon back to the boy and said, "Go, carry him back to town." After the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times. So this is not the plan. Remember, he was just supposed to take off. But the boy went back to town. It left just the two of them in the field. And instead of just running off, David couldn't help himself. He comes back to where Jonathan is with his face to the ground, and they kissed each other and wept together. And David wept the most. And, of course, just for us Western macho men kissing other men in that culture is very common. It's not anything unusual. And they're weeping at this tragedy. Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever.'" Then David left, and Jonathan went back to town. So the break between Saul and David is now complete. There's no more chance for reconciliation. There's no more, well, it was just a fit of rage, come on back, and he didn't mean it, and Saul, well, yeah, okay, no, I'm good, I won't harm you. That now there's none of that. It's broken. And David has to now be a fugitive. David has to be a man on the run. I'm going to stop there, but I'm going to ask if anybody has any questions, and I'll even repeat them for anybody watching, if anybody does. Question or comment or thought about any of this? Don't you think this would make... What? Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for the compliment. I don't know why this hasn't been made into a movie multiple times. I mean, I know it's been made into a movie maybe, but I don't think it's ever been done the way it could be done. I mean, this is, it's history, but it's also an incredible drama here of a king spiraling out of control and a young hero and who's best friends with the prince and the princess. And I mean, it's just got, everything you can imagine in it of drama, but it's tragic too. I mean, it's a tragic story of what power did to Saul. Saul doesn't start off as a bad guy. He doesn't start off as an evil guy or a criminal or anything. He starts off as a warrior that is willing to go fight for Israel. But he is not willing to listen to God's direction, and then he's not willing to see that God has moved on and God is doing something else. And it is, his paranoia, his jealousy, his irrationality is just tragic. And it's going to continue for several more chapters before more tragedy strikes for Saul's entire family. But I think the author really wants us to be clear with us that nowhere is David at fault. In terms of David is not trying to overthrow Saul. He's not trying to usurp him. He's not trying to sabotage him. David is loyal all through this. And even on the run, we're going to see that David continues to be a loyal soldier and unwilling to really prematurely take the throne by violent means. He's biding his time, not waiting on the Lord's time. And he is loyal to Saul, even when Saul is a crazy man. And that makes him an even more attractive and winsome figure. And it makes the story even more tragic when we think about Saul. And I always think it's kind of interesting that the name Saul, after this, is not a banished name. Saul of Tarsus is, of course, Paul the Apostle. So Saul does not, as a name, does not go out of favor after this episode. But King Saul is certainly not a person in the Bible to be imitated or celebrated. So next week we will kind of study this period of David the fugitive. David on the run, and that goes on for several chapters of David on the run. You remember the movie The Fugitive? Well, there's a TV series, and then there was the movie with Harrison Ford, and it's about this doctor who is falsely accused of murder and is on the run constantly. And that's kind of, David, this next part of David's journey could be called David the Fugitive. And he's constantly on the run from Saul and in peril continuously. So it's another interesting chapter in this saga. Let me have a word of prayer. Thanks, Lord, for the scriptures that tell us about real people. Lord, we can tell these are real life people, flesh and blood people. And Lord, we thank you for David, this ancestor of Jesus, that he sought after your heart. Even though, Lord, we know he wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. But Lord, we can see that he had a passion for loving and following you and being the man after your heart. And as we read more about him, we can see why you decided that it is his line that would be the line of Messiah, the line of Jesus. And so as we dig into this story, we ask that you'd teach us lessons about brotherhood and loyalty and other lessons that we can learn, and that you'd be with us now. Amen. All right, we'll see y'all next week.